Hello, everyone. This is a hybrid come with me episode all about my experiences on a tour that I recently took to Poland. And I will be posting a few of the videos and photos that I was able to take, but honestly, I could not take many. It was rather surprising to me, but I couldn't. And so consequently, there will be more talking on this video than in most come with me's. I was on a tour that was titled The Jews of Poland. And as you can imagine, that was a heavy topic. We went into a lot of very sacred and religious spaces. And so consequently, it was not, in my mind, comfortable or even honorable to take videos or photos in some of these particular places. Security for every Jewish organization in Poland is pretty significant. And so consequently, I did not want to be pulling out my camera and doing my YouTube videos. It made no sense. Plus, there's a lot of sadness that happened to the Jews of Poland. And so consequently, taking videos of those particular places is hard, really hard, and not appropriate. But yet, I wanted to share this with you because I think it's a very, very important topic that we should be having even today. We should never forget our history and the horrors of the genocides that have gone on in the past. And in this one, specifically, the genocide of the Jewish people of Poland. I think it's important in our futures. Otherwise, history seems to repeat itself. So, without further ado, I am going to talk about Warsaw, Poland, Tarnów, Lubeck, and finally Krakow. And like I mentioned, I went into and toured the Jewish ghettos, the horrors of the Jewish ghettos, the horrors of the death camps, the labor camps. I even walked through cemeteries where very old tombstones, can tell the stories of the people who are buried there. I also saw a recreated city. How do I say? Unsuppressible spirit of people and how we can recover from our worst nightmares, the darkness that sometimes we inflict on each other and rise out of it and create something anew. I stayed in two beautiful hotels, one in Warsaw, one in Krakow. And I have to say, I also had one of the most fabulous meals I've ever had in my life in Warsaw. And the couple that I went to that dinner with have traveled all over the world and they concurred. It was amazing. But this trip was a heavy trip. As I mentioned, Poland's history is heavy. I think not being Polish myself and not being Jewish, I had no idea how heavy the history of Poland is. It's as though it just continually gets chopped up by its neighbors. And Poland is a very flat country. And so consequently, there's no place to hide. Maybe that's part of the reason. It's also a very agriculturally rich country, which means its neighbors want it. And so who knows? But we went, really touring it from the perspective of Poland's Jews, and I did not realize that Poland had the largest Jewish population in all of the world at the start of the Second World War. Hitler walked into Poland first. That was the first country Hitler's Nazis invaded in 1939. And when the war was over and Hitler lost, obviously, the Allied leaders, sadly, which is the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union, at the Yalta Conference, made the horrific decision to give half of Poland to the Soviets and the other half to what would become East Germany. Both halves now had to, after 6 years of war, had to live under the rule, the, how do you want to say, the tight rule of the communism that was really headquartered in the Soviet Union. People were displaced. Ethnically German people had to move to the western side of Poland, so they would be part of East Germany. And Poles who lived in what now was East Germany had to move to the eastern side of Poland underneath the reign of the Soviet Union. So, it's interesting to me how at the end of the war, why did anyone think it was appropriate to chop up Poland? We can't understand the context of the time. And maybe it was who the three powers were, and the Soviet Union had to be given what the Soviet Union wanted. I have no idea. But to me, it's very bizarre. So here we are, fast forward to 1989. After almost 5 decades of communistic rule in Poland, it finally ended. As we all know, the falling of the Berlin Wall ended the communism that was both present in, East Germany, Poland, as well as most of the Baltic states. It took that long, really, when you think about it, 40 plus years for the whole process of communism to really fall apart. And Poland really suffered during that time period. It was fascinating to me that it really has only been since 1989 that people in Poland, and we're talking the youth, because my daughter, my youngest child, my daughter was born in 1988, and she's now 37 years old. And I think, oh my gosh, what if my daughter Kelly was the first generation that really had the opportunity to learn about Polish history, to feel Polish, to not be under the rule of the thumb of communism. Anyone who's my generation, we were too young to have experienced World War II, but all of our youth would have been spent growing up under communism. And we would have hit that point at about age 35, maybe 40 years old or even older, where suddenly people had to reinvent themselves because they had known nothing but communism. Yeah, so I remember though in the early 1990s, visiting London, and Polish hotels in London were filled with young Polish workers. And at the time, I really didn't get it. As an American, sometimes our country is big and we're somewhat isolated, and we often don't think about the complexities of the rest of the world. And why those London hotels were filled with young Polish workers is, yes, the Berlin Wall had fallen, the reign of communism was over, but Poland was incredibly poor and they had to rebuild their economy. So there were no jobs. No jobs for the young people. And so consequently, the young people actually left Poland to, at that time, the UK was part of the EU. And so many of the young Polish people went to London to work. It's very interesting to me because in recent years, you don't see that anymore. The youth that are back in Poland, they are now, in their 30s, and they are rebuilding or a part of this rebuilt culture of Poland. I think it would be so interesting, and I'm sure if some of you have books that you could recommend, I think it would be so interesting to read memoirs of Polish people who have actually gone through this process because we don't hear much about that. We truly don't. And I think it would be fascinating. Now, the tour. As I mentioned, the tour was titled The Jews of Poland. Now, I'm not Jewish, so I was the outlier on this trip as the only non-Jew on the trip. It was an amazing experience. I'm actually Catholic, and Poland is possibly the most Catholic country in the world, with about it depends on how the reporting is, but it's somewhere between 73, 74, and 80% of the population claiming to be Catholic. The beloved and now sainted Pope John Paul II actually came from Krakow, Poland, and which I think is so interesting. But you may not know, as I didn't, that in 1939, Poland had the largest Jewish population in the world. That was 1939 was when Germany invaded Poland and started World War II. 1/3 of the world's Jews lived in Poland at that time. That's kind of incredible. We don't really think about that anymore because Israel exists and we think The largest number of Jews today live in the United States as well as in Israel. But at that time, 1939, this is where the Jewish people lived. Now, this Poland trip was unusual on many levels, and it had many firsts for me. I talked, I think, a few weeks ago about how midlife is about getting comfortable with discomfort. And this trip was completely uncomfortable for me. There was so much newness about this trip that I had not built up my newness muscle, my comfort level with newness. Number one, it was a trip that was much more educational than fun. Like I said, it was heavy, heavy topics. It was more like walking back in history and walking back as a Jewish woman, which obviously I'm not, but I got to actually step into so many of those historical fiction novels that I read and be a Jewish woman during a very, very difficult time. This was also my first trip to Poland. It was actually the first Eastern European country I have ever visited. I have no idea of the language. I had no context. I had no way to place it in any way, shape, or form. Having lived in Paris for as long as I did, there's a comfort level with French. And so consequently, I'm comfortable in a number of those languages that have aspects of French in the language. This language, forget it. Polish, I had not a clue. So it was hard. That was really interesting to me and hard. But I have to say, the Polish people, certainly the youth of Poland, all speak English. They can switch back and forth. And even on the airplanes, the stewardesses would switch back and forth, which are flight attendants, which was fascinating to me. This was a tour to learn about the history of the Jews of Poland. And to do so, I went to synagogues. I sat in the women's section of the shuls or the synagogues. I participated in Shabbat dinners. I listened to my fellow tour companions sing songs in Hebrew, used Yiddish phrases. I heard poems, and the leader actually read some of the final letters that people had written before they were sent into the gas chambers, basically. I learned so much from the professor who led this group. It was an American Israeli man who has taught in both American and Israeli universities. But what was so unique about all of that is that for 10 days or 11 days, I was Jewish and I got to experience it as a Jewish woman because I was surrounded by other Jewish women. Now, how'd I get there? I flew Polish Airlines from London, and I flew the KLM connector from Krakow to Amsterdam. This is the very first time I have ever flown in Europe, in between European cities. I always take the train. So this was interesting and stressful, I have to say. I also had multiple stops and multiple airports. I flew from Boston to London on Delta, and I stayed in London for a few days before our tour began. Then I flew from London to Warsaw on Polish Airlines, which is called LOT. And then I took, let's see, when I got to Krakow, I flew from Krakow to Amsterdam on KLM Connector. And then I flew from Amsterdam to Boston back on Delta. So it was a lot of cities and also a lot of different currency. I had Polish zlotys or however zloty, I can't, you can tell I can't pronounce it. I had British pounds, I had euros, and I had dollars. It was nuts. And I'm not sure I would do this again, but I'll talk about that in a future podcast and how to do tours like this when you are going to multiple countries, which involve multiple plane flight, travel situations as well as currency. Also on this trip, my clothing was all casual. I mean, like ultra casual, with a focus on comfort with as little luggage as possible. I had one dress with me, which I wore in London. I never unpacked the dress after I left London. Warmth was key. This trip was actually the very, very end of October. And so consequently, warmth was key. I would recommend going to Poland before October. Honestly, I had no idea it was as cold and rainy as it is at that time of the year. That coldness and the rain actually made videotaping very, very difficult, as you'll see on the next photo. Okay, back to Poland. And why is there a tour titled The Jews of Poland? Well, as I said, a major portion of the Jews in the world lived in Poland prior to 1939. But how did that happen? We have to go back almost 1,000 years. During the reign of King Casimir or Kazimierz, and I'm massacring all of these names, he was the king of Poland in the 1400s, and he welcomed in at that time Jews who had experienced persecution in Western Europe. There were already some pogroms and certainly discrimination against Jewish people in Western Europe. Obviously during this time, America didn't exist, and other parts of the world really were burgeoning populations and economies. And so the real center of the world, to a great extent, was in Europe. Well, this king said, come on in. And then some more things happened. Wars happened, of course. Humans were always fighting about something. And then World War One happened. And after World War One, that time period between World War One and World War Two, the newly independent Poland extended full citizenship and voting rights to its Jewish citizens. And this was landmark. Jewish cultural life flourished in Poland as it did nowhere else. Jews flocked to Poland, continuing to immigrate from all across Europe, I should say, after experiencing anti Semitism. Anti Semitism has, I think, always existed, and unfortunately, I think it's back full force and growing. More on that in an upcoming podcast or over on Substack. But Poland opened its arms between World War One and World War Two. It was estimated that 80% of all Jews in the world lived in Poland. And Poland at that time was the largest country in Europe. The, the country lines were very different from what it is today, much larger. There were all different sects of Judaism in Poland at that time, from Orthodox, which is, I believe, Poland actually is where the Orthodox religions or sects of Judaism actually were founded. There were conservative Jews and Reform Jews, what we call conservative and Reform today, as well as many cultural Jews who didn't practice their religion, but kept all the Jewish cultures and traditions, I should say. Many of my Jewish friends in Boston fall into this category. Their children may or may not have bar or bat mitzvahs, but they certainly marry Jewish people, even though they rarely go to temple and synagogues. They don't keep kosher and often practice very few Jewish traditions. Back when I was in, believe it or not, when I was in junior high and high school, my public school in Minneapolis had a very significant Jewish population. And so many of my high school friends were all practicing Jews. It's really interesting to me now when I look back on it and when I talk about it. Many people are surprised because they don't think of Minneapolis. Minneapolis doesn't have a very large Jewish population, but they certainly don't think of a public school as having a significant Jewish population, but it did. It's really interesting. I went to more first Seders than I can remember. I absolutely loved them. And because of that, I think it gave me a comfort level with Judaism that I think has just kind of added a beautiful layer of uniqueness and even understanding to my life today. And many of my good friends in Boston are Jewish. So What have I done? I've had to learn how to make Passover kugels and desserts, and I love it, love it, love it. For those of you that do not know, my son actually is half Jewish, and therefore his children, those grandchildren of mine, are one quarter Jewish, all of whom would have been put into ghettos and death camps if they had been born during that time period of the Nazi genocide of the Jews. So I think this touched me in a way that maybe is unique. I don't know. I'd love to hear from you. Even though many of these people were non practicing or even cultural Jews, it didn't save them from the Nazis. Nazis made no differentiation between a cultural Jew and an Orthodox Jew at all. So by 1939, when the Nazis marched into Poland, about 3 million Jews lived in Poland, which was about 30%, believe it or not, 30% of Warsaw's population and over 40% of Krakow's population. Because, between the World War I and World War II, Poland was a safe place for Jews. They could enjoy Jewish life. They also felt a part of the Polish community. Children went to school. Professionals such as doctors and lawyers were able to practice. The arts just absolutely flourished. Music, theater, artistic endeavors all became part of the fabric of Polish life. And Poland was one of the most cultured and well-educated populations in all of Europe, probably because of their very high Jewish population, because Jewish people learned how to read, literacy rate much higher than non-Jews and at a much earlier time period. The Jewish people have always put great value on education and literacy. So I think that's really what an incredible contribution to the Polish society. Sadly, though, this concentration of Jewish people also made it the natural target for the Nazi operation to begin. Their systematic, meticulous, horrifying process of genocide, basically to rid the world of Jews. 9 out of 10 Polish Jews were murdered by the Nazis. What was fascinating to me, though, was that the places we visited on this trip, the Jewish community centers, the Jewish museums, the extensive research into Poland's Jewish people is now being done almost exclusively by non-Jewish Poles. Now, that's maybe not all that surprising, given there are very few Jews left in Poland. But this is also the first generation post World War II that hasn't lived under Soviet control. And the young people of Poland now are the first generation since 1939 to really explore, who are we as Polish people? What is our legacy? What was our involvement in World War I, World War II? What happened? And in order to do that, they also, because of the high Jewish population, they must explore the history of the Jews. And I thought it was really fascinating. Many of the people in my tour group asked these non-Jewish young people why they had such a deep interest in Poland's Jewish history. Why were they leading the museums? Why were they doing the extensive research as to, especially in the ghettos, who lived where, how many people lived in that particular home? And the consistent response from these young people was, there is no history of Poland without the history of Poland's Jews. I thought that was fascinating and really quite aware of what the fabric of their country. We began the tour in Warsaw. And as I mentioned, I flew from London Heathrow Airport into Warsaw. Very interesting, how to get to cities in Warsaw. It just depends on the Polish population in your particular city. For instance, in Boston, there's not a very large Polish population. So there was no way to get there. Absolutely no way to get there direct. And so I went to London first and spent a few days in London. And then I flew via Polish Airlines, which is called LOT, L-O-T, into Warsaw. Lot was well run, I have to say, but it is obviously a growing airline. I purchased business class tickets, which actually was an old, I don't know, 727, something like that. And so there were coach seats all the way up. There were no larger seats at all, even in the business section. But what they did in the business section is they left the middle seats empty. I thought that was very clever. And strangely, it worked. I have to say, the plane was possibly the cleanest plane I've ever flown on. And that was a precursor to my entire experience in Poland. Poland is clean, unbelievably clean. So the tour, as I said, began in Warsaw. And driving into the city from the airport, the taxi drove past, brand new buildings. I would call them kind of skyscrapers, low skyscrapers. They were all glass covered. There were lots and lots of trees everywhere. The roads are packed. Traffic is significant, partially, I think, because of the infrastructure maybe hasn't kept up with the growth of Poland. So we were off the two-lane highway pretty quickly. And what you then saw was lots and lots of parks, I have to say, parks with beautiful trees. And because it was the very end of October, all of the leaves have turned, and it was absolutely gorgeous. But you'd see these apartment blocks that were very bizarre because they were obviously built by during the time period of the communism rule. And yet you'd see like one old building, and then you'd see four of those boxy communism ugly buildings. Nothing felt right. It was really strange, like an architectural jumble, I call it. But because I didn't know much about the history of Warsaw yet, I couldn't put into context what I was seeing. Then the taxi ended up at the Hotel Bristol, which is one of the few buildings actually that survived the war. The Hotel Bristol is a nice hotel, very nice hotel. But as I looked out at the street, the hotel is located really at the start of the old town or at the entrance to the old town. I got this vibe of Disney World. Sounds really strange, like Epcot Center. It all felt incredibly fake. And what I learned was that it was fake. It was all recreated because Warsaw was wiped out by the Nazis. At the end of World War II, there was nothing left in Warsaw. It was rubble, other than maybe one or two buildings. And in a few minutes, I'll explain why. Today, Warsaw, though, is over 2 million people, and it is Poland's thriving center for business, for politics, and for banking. It's just growing like crazy. In Warsaw, we visited the Museum of the History of the Polish Jews, or the Polin, Polin, Museum, which is truly one of the most incredible museums I've ever been to. Even Rick Steves, the famous travel writer, says it is the best European historical museum that he's ever been to, and I have to agree. Again, for some reason, I don't have video for you. I wish I did. But as you walk through the museum, and they're all kind of experiential exhibits, rooms, you go from room to room. It was amazing because the headset actually knows what room you're in and tells you which way to go. I thought it was fascinating. So it's really high tech. But as you walked into each one of the rooms, and the museum is huge, you got a sense of what really was happening historically to Poland during that particular time. Yes, it's from the Jews of Poland's perspective, but it also gives you a sense of what Poland's history is. Because as the young people said, you can't talk about the history of Poland without the history of the Jews. It is so complicated. Poland has been conquered by its neighbors over and over and over. They're surrounded by what was historically a number of different empires. Think of the Prussian Empire, Austrian Prussian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and of course the Russian Empire. And all of these people had different religions and different economics and yeah, and different missions. And Poland seemed to always be kind of crushed in the middle of it. Is crazy. Now, inside the Poland Museum, if you go, know that there is a fantastic cafe in the middle where there are actually ladies cooking lunch, believe it or not. And there's tables all over the place. There's even espresso coffee, which is my addiction. So if you happen to go to Warsaw, you happen to go to the Poland Museum, make it a half day. Plan at least a half a day, if not more, and plan to have lunch there. And take breaks as needed because the Poland Museum is truly the best way to understand Poland's history. On this trip, we also visited the oldest surviving synagogue in Poland. I could not take any photos in this place. The outside of the building is nothing. It's kind of tucked between trees and really could be anything. Almost looks like a warehouse from the outside. But inside, and the security was pretty intense, but inside was a gorgeous, built in 1898, alive and practicing Jewish synagogue. We walked into a prayer ceremony where a young boy was actually singing the prayers in the front of the room. I obviously went upstairs to the women's section. And then after the ceremony ended, we shared a celebratory lunch with the members of the synagogue congregation, which was really quite beautiful. I mean, I felt so honored to have been invited. We had a discussion then in the synagogue with the chief rabbi of Poland, who happens to be an American expat who moved to Poland. It was a very, very interesting, again, interesting conversation. Like I said, this trip was lots and lots of learning. That was amazing. We also visited two Jewish cemeteries on this trip, very old cemeteries. I'm going to give you a few photos and videos of those cemeteries. And I loved how the professor who ran our group explained that cemeteries really shouldn't be sad. Cemeteries should teach us, have the opportunity to teach us about the lives of the people who are buried there. And what I thought was so special was if we look at the old tombstones, we can imagine things like what did they do? What mattered to that person? And in contrast to, what we do today, which is just a stone block that says, Sharri Harmel, born on this date, died on this date, and that's it. And you have no more knowledge of what mattered to Sharri Harmel. I think that's fascinating. You'll see the stones that are placed on Jewish tombstones as memorials. It's really quite fascinating. So I'll let you take a look at that because I think these are sacred, but also touching, and touching that we're remembering some of the people. As I said, the old town of Warsaw has been meticulously rebuilt. But why was Warsaw turned into rubble by the Nazis, whereas Krakow was not? Well, there were two uprisings in Warsaw that completely pissed off Hitler. I don't know how else to put it. In 1939, as we all know, the Nazis systematically took over all Jewish-owned businesses, their homes, their possessions, their bank accounts. They moved all the Jews into walled ghettos. And tens of thousands of people lived in these walled-in areas in Krakow and Warsaw. These were areas where previously maybe only a few hundred people had lived before the war, and now there were tens of thousands. So Jews were regularly shot on the streets in the ghettos because the SS patrolled the ghettos. Disease was rampant, starvation was everywhere. But as the Nazis decided their planned genocide of the Jews wasn't happening fast enough, they set up what they called quote unquote resettlement camps and started transporting Jews from the ghettos into resettlement camps titled Treblinka. Some of these you've heard, Auschwitz, Birkenau. I could go on and on. These are death camps, no other way to put them. And Poland had the most death camps in all of Europe. The Jews were their primary target, were the Nazis' primary target, but Nazis also killed most of the Polish intelligentsia, like professors, the political leaders, artists, musicians, anyone who was at the top of their profession, as well as anyone who was considered traitor to the Nazi cause, maybe hid a Jewish family or a Jewish person, maybe had a Jewish boyfriend or was rumored to be Jewish, or anyone who was different, anyone who suffered from mental illness, anyone who had maybe a different sexual orientation. I think you wouldn't have a chance if you were a gay person, quite honestly. And also the physically handicapped, anyone who had infirmity of any kind. So back to the uprisings. Inside the ghettos, there were rumors that were starting to come back to the ghettos of what was happening in the so-called resettlement camps. And so a few remaining Jews of the ghetto in Warsaw fought back started on April 19th, 1943. Incredible, because we are now nearing the end of the war. So these people, this tiny group of remaining Jews, they had few weapons, even less food. They were all starving to death and must have had minimal hope, fought back against the Nazis. And maybe it was the last way to reclaim whatever dignity they felt they had left. And you'd think the Nazis would squash them in, one day. It took the Nazis 1 month before they could overtake the people of the rebellion. And they basically killed everyone that was, left in the ghetto. So I did want you to see how did the Jewish people get the weapons in and even the black market food in and out of the ghettos? Well, the children went down into the sewers. If you want to get a better sense of what it was like to be in the ghetto, watch the Oscar-winning movie The Pianist, which is actually the true story of a Jewish concert pianist, and I cannot say the man's name, something like Vladislav Spielman. He survived the war and lived through the Warsaw Ghetto uprising with the help of Jews, Poles, and even a Nazi officer. That movie is a true story and of what it was like to be in the ghetto during the ghetto uprising. Fantastic movie. And as I said, it won an Oscar that year. So that's the first uprising. Then in the summer, actually August of 1944, we're now getting to the very end of the war, right? So Nazis aren't doing very well. But this is when the second uprising happened. Like I said, it was becoming clear that the Nazis' days in Warsaw were numbered, and the Soviets were only about 25 miles away. They were just on the other side of the river. Warsaw had a huge underground army, huge for Warsaw, not in comparison to the German army. And on August 1st, 1944, 30,000 Polish resistance fighters and civilians, which included women and children, launched an attack on their Nazi oppressors. It took the Nazis 2 months to overcome that uprising. Hitler, absolutely filled with fury over the attack, ordered the city of Warsaw to be leveled. And that is why Warsaw was nothing but rubble and a couple of buildings. Now, the Red Army, the Soviet Army, could have stepped in at any point, but they didn't. They sat on the sidelines across the river and watched it all play out. Because of Hitler's retaliation, every single building in Warsaw that you see today, other than a few of them, were all built sometime after 1945. And then, because the Soviet Union occupied Poland from 1945 until 1989, many of the subsequent buildings are those characterless Soviet boxy apartment complexes. Now, the Poles did rebuild their old town, and this is actually quite pretty. They rebuilt their old town. They also rebuilt a number of other buildings, which I will show you in some of the photographs. They did a wonderful job, I have to admit. But there is a sense of Disney World when walking the streets. And maybe that comes from me having experienced, a lot of European cities where this did not happen. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you've been to Poland or you are going to Poland, comment on that because I would love to hear what your thoughts are. The buildings were built to look like they did in the 16, 1700s, but they just haven't had any time to age. But maybe all in good time. We stayed, as I mentioned, at the Bristol Hotel, which miraculously did survive World War II. It is a pre-World War II building. It was saved because the Bristol was used by the Nazis as a VIP hotel and a bordello. Of course, we have to have a bordello whenever there's VIPs, right? But the hotel actually continued to make history as it became the home of the first Israeli embassy that I think foreign diplomatic station of Israel after the creation of Israel. And it was made the first Israeli embassy in 1948. I'm going to show you a little video from my hotel room because it really gives you an overview of what Warsaw looks like. I am in my hotel in Warsaw, Poland, and I just had to show you a photo from the window of my bathroom. I'm up on the top floor, which is the Chambre de Bon in Paris, not the penthouse. That is right down here is the rebuilt Old Town. Warsaw, I had to show this to you because Warsaw was flattened after the Second World War. There was nothing here. It was just ground. And all of this has been rebuilt, which is pretty incredible. Absolutely incredible. Yeah, the old town looks honestly a bit like Disney World from the standpoint that everything was built at the same time. So you don't have the aging process in an old house next to a really old house like you might get in Paris or London. But they rebuilt the city, and imagine what this will look like in 200 years or even 50 years. It will look remarkably well established. And sometimes it's hard to look at all of this and think there was nothing here. Absolutely nothing. I think there's a chance that church was one of the few remaining buildings in all of Warsaw after the Second World War. I mentioned that my friends and I had one of the best dinners in our lives in Warsaw, and I wanted to give you a little bit of an uplift here, and that is that the restaurant was called Rozblat 20. Rozblat is the name of the street, and it's Rozblat 20, which has one Michelin star. Course after course. And they're little. It's a tasting menu, but it was the most delicious food combinations I think I have ever eaten, as well as the two people I was having dinner with who have traveled the world said the exact same thing. It was incredible. So if you go to Warsaw, I highly recommend you put this restaurant on the top of your list. Now to Krakow. Krakow, in contrast, was interesting. It was beautiful. It was messy with old architecture. There were college students everywhere. Culture was everywhere. And that's because Krakow remains Poland's cultural and intellectual center. Krakow is in southern Poland, bordering Ukraine, Slovakia, and Czech Republic. And just to give you a frame of reference, prior to World War II, 40%, 40 plus percent of Krakow was Jewish. And again, there were lots of different sects, from Orthodox to non-religious, but cultural Jews. This was a highly, highly educated population of people because it also has the oldest university in Europe, which I think it's called, I can never can say this person's name, Copernicus, which was a university that was established in the 14th century, believe it or not. So Krakow is filled with museums, small shops, great restaurants, quirky corners, and highly educated people. The architecture is gorgeous. Much of it needs some restoration work, but I have no doubt that that is going to happen at some point in the future, given what I have seen Poland has created. We visited Kazimierz, a section of Krakow that was made the Jewish ghetto. It's named after the king, King Casimir, who welcomed in the Jews in the 1400s. That's what this section was called long before the Nazis marched into Poland, but it's a separate area, or a little district, I should say, of Krakow, and that is the location that the Nazis designated as the Jewish ghetto. Inside the area of Kazimierz. Now, that particular area had Jewish people before. It just wasn't this crazy concentration that went on when the Nazis moved in. There are many, consequently, many Jewish landmarks within the Kazimierz section, and lots of Holocaust sites, which is very interesting. Schindler, which for those of you who watched the movie Schindler's List, Schindler's Factory Museum is also in this area. I heard some really fascinating stories about Schindler, not like a super good guy in his everyday values, ethics, but he saved over 1,000 Jews and actually received what's called the Medal of the Righteous People, which is a medal that Israel gives to people who have saved Jews. So that led, believe it or not, to some very interesting conversations about how sometimes people behave not above board, not with good values, and yet their contribution to the greater world makes you able to accept how they live their everyday life because they made a difference in a more collective, big way. So interesting. Schindler's factory was a Jewish factory, actually. And then when the Nazis moved in, they actually gave it to Schindler. And then you know the story from the movie. Thankfully, Krakow's cityscape virtually remained unscathed during World War II. Hitler really had plans to make it his Polish capital. Hitler falls in love with cities and then he saves them. The same was true of Paris. And thankfully, Krakow was saved. Krakow is probably, in addition to having been have a real significant Jewish population, over 40%, it is also now probably one of the most Catholic cities in a very, very Catholic country. Pope John Paul II was born in Krakow, or born in the area, and then he became the Archbishop of Krakow before he was called to Rome to be Pope. And Pope John Paul II is remembered very warmly by the Jewish people because I did not know this, but Pope John Paul II actually said it is a sin to be anti-Semitic. And he was the first pope who ever made that proclamation that to be anti-Semitic is a sin. To those of you who are Catholic, you know what that means. Pope John Paul II, while he was Archbishop of Krakow, he actually pushed against communism with great force. Is quite an interesting because communism, as you all know, doesn't allow any kind of religious practices. Your religion is to be communistic. It's for the religion of the whole, so to speak. And Pope John Paul, who was then Archbishop before he was Pope, pushed against that and pushed against the Catholics being able to celebrate their religious traditions, which had really kind of gone underground. So he played a very important role, or plays a very important role, in Poland's history as it relates to Catholicism. Pope John Paul II has been deemed a saint by the Catholic Church since his death, which, obviously means an awful lot to Catholics around the world as well as specifically to Poland's Catholics. I did take a couple of photos of the church where he practiced Mass, and I thought you would find it very interesting. Now, I apologize because I could not go into as much depth in Krakow as I did in Warsaw, and that is partially because I got sick. Not surprising, considering it was such a heavy trip. And also, a number of people on the trip started to share a cold. And so, one of the things that I think I would put on my list if I ever went to Poland again would be in Krakow, would be Wawel Hill, which is a symbol, I should say, of Polish royalty and independence. But there was no way I could make it up there. It's up a hill, and I also missed touring Auschwitz and Birkenau. Now, the Nazis. Let's talk about Auschwitz, Birkenau. The Nazis murdered 6 million Jews, and half of those were Poland's Jews. It was systematic. It was well thought out. It's really quite incredible. It was shocking to me. What the Nazis figured out is they had old military bases that they actually made political prisoners stay at, and then they decided they were a perfect setup to turn into death camps. And Auschwitz alone, it's estimated that over 1 million Jews were murdered at Auschwitz. I visited a concentration camp, death camp called Majdanki. I'm sure I'm massacring it, which is a camp that is just outside of Lublin. Lublin, I think is how I pronounce it. As I said in the very beginning, most of the death camps of the Nazis were located in Poland. Walking through that camp, I have to say, I almost got physically ill. Going through that shower area, and I'll attach photos, and seeing the empty canisters of gas in the gas chambers and on the walls of the rooms where people were gassed was this like blue, foggy, look like watercolor almost on the walls. And that is partially the gas reacting against the cement of the walls of those particular rooms. It was horrifying. Then from the gas chambers, we walked over to the ovens in the crematorium, and they look like bread ovens. It was with, how do I say it? I don't know, beds that you would push a body into the oven. It was devastating. It's in my mind still. So I apologize if I got quiet here. I found myself crying through this whole experience, not sure I could stop. And it was it was incredible. And then there were these bins with shoes of the victims. And no matter how many times I've read historical fiction books about what went on in the Second World War, or even looked at photographs, it did not touch me, nor did it touch any of my tour companions in the way that it did when you actually see it. It's unbelievable. Unbelievably horrific. I don't know how else to put it. Well, let's take a breather here. More uplifting was all that's happening now in Poland around their history as the center of the world's Jewish population. The Jews who are now in Poland are a fraction of what existed before the war. But those Jews are growing, as well as Poland's people are embracing their Jewish history. Many Poles are finding out that they are partially Jewish because somebody's, they remember somebody's grandmother had a bookshelf in her house that had books in it that were in Hebrew. Another person talked about how Someone came in and said, I think I might be Jewish. And the reason they think they're Jewish is because some of the songs that were sung to them as a child are traditionally Jewish songs. So there is this resurgence of finding out Jewish roots that have been squashed and hidden and put into closets, never to come out again, suddenly being opened up and saying, look at us. I think 23andMe needs to go into Poland and allow every Polish person to, free of charge, do a 23andMe test to find out if they have any Ashkenazi Jew. So, the other thing that I wanted to share with you before I close this up is we visited a synagogue in Lankot. I think I'm pronouncing that right, Lankot. It is the best preserved synagogue in all of Poland. It was built in 1761 and is now a museum. And I wanted you to see it because it was the most beautiful place. It's been restored, and you could see parts of it are further along in its restoration. But it's fascinating. It's so interesting. So, did you see I can't remember what it's called. It starts with a B, the center, how beautiful the center was. And the arc is just gorgeous, which being Catholic, it's really interesting to me how, obviously Jesus was Jewish. And so consequently, many of our traditions are very similar to the Jewish traditions. So the ark looks like the sacristy at the front of the church where the host is kept. So there's so many similarities. It was fascinating to me. But also in this particular synagogue, you can see up at the top, and you might want to go back and look at it, you could see some of the astrological signs, which is fascinating. Like, why would that be in a synagogue, right? But we visited multiple shuls, which is Yiddish for synagogue in Krakow. And I wanted to share with you a little folklore, folk tale, I guess we want to call it, that the Isaac Shul has around it. The Isaac Shul is just a clean looking white synagogue, but there's this fascinating folk tale that's associated with it that I think we could all gain something from. On a side note, leaving behind some of the Jewish history, Poland is honestly the cleanest country I have ever visited. Every single person takes their job seriously. It's like they're kind of like, kindergartners. When gardeners go and do something new, everything's a new day and they're in it 110%. That's how the Polish people are with their jobs. And I think that's why this is the cleanest country I have ever been in. Every hotel room was super clean. The restaurants were clean. The museums were clean. Toilets in every location, public toilets, museum toilets, restaurant toilets, spotless, spotless. The airports were clean. I've never been in such a clean airport. The airport lounges were clean. Like this lady would come around and scoop up crumbs faster. It was like an army of cleaners who took their job seriously in the airport, which, where does that happen? Also, the young people of Poland are incredibly tall, incredibly tall. I've never seen such tall people. Even in the synagogue where we actually sat into the service and had a little bit of lunch with them after, so many of the young men, because they had on their hats, so that even added more height to them, but they were unbelievably tall. It was wild. You will see loads and loads of young people in Poland. And that makes sense because the old are gone, and the next group were all my generation, were all raised under communism. And so consequently, you probably didn't have a lot of children. And suddenly, the youth are there and, encouraged about the future. We only have children typically when we can possibly have hope for the future. The country of Poland now has only been free from Soviet occupation for around 35 years. And so it makes sense that these are young people who are trying to define what life in a democratic, capitalistic country can be. I was unbelievably impressed by the resiliency of the Polish people. They have suffered greatly, and yet seem to have now be this generation that really has hope in their country, hope for their country, hope in their country, and they can start to make those long-term choices that guide their lives and the direction of their country. And I'm going to end with a Jewish folktale surrounding the Isaac Shul or the Isaac Synagogue, which was told by Dr. David Bernstein, who was our tour leader. And for those of you that know this folktale, please forgive my abbreviated story. I have attached below in the notes section a Facebook description that's actually told by a rabbi. And I think some of you may totally enjoy it. But there's a lesson here for all of us. And here it is. For 3 nights, Isaac, who was a very poor Polish Jewish man, had a dream that he needed to go to the Charles Bridge in Prague. And under the bridge was a treasure. Now, Isaac, as I said, was a poor man, but he decided after 3 nights that he had to go there. His family thought he was completely crazy. He went to Prague, he found the bridge, but when he went under the bridge, he met a man who asked him, "What are you doing here?" Isaac shared with the man his dreams. The man laughed and turned to him and said, "I can't believe in dreams because, as strange as it sounds, I had a dream that I needed to go to Krakow, go to Isaac Street, and visit a man named Isaac, and go into this man's house because underneath the stove in that house is a treasure." Well, of course, the man said, "I'm not going there." And they both laughed and returned to their respective homes, right? They're just a dream. How funny is that? But Isaac wondered, what if? And he happened to move the stove, dig up the stones that were underneath the stove, and sure enough, there was a treasure. And Isaac used this treasure. He became a very, very wealthy man because of this treasure. He used this treasure as a sign from God. And that's when he built the Isaac Synagogue in Krakow on Isaac Street. That treasure made him a wealthy man. And it was really interesting because Dr. Bernstein said the message of this folk tale is that sometimes you have to travel far away to be able to see the treasures that are right in your home. I love that story, and I think that's a great way to end today. I hope you enjoyed hearing a bit about Poland, even as hard as it was, and maybe you'll be inspired to visit Poland. It's an amazing country. Yes, it's got a dark history, but to not repeat the evils of the past, we have to be reminded of our history. We can't forget. Now, if you want more conversations like this, do join me here, subscribe on YouTube, and also join me over on Substack. That's where I go deeper into our thoughts and the questions that we might all be asking as we try to design our next chapters. I have a free version of Substack, but also a paid version. And the paid version is where you get access to live conversations, some extended interviews, and more inspiration to help you all design and live your fabulous next chapter. And I want to tell you, don't forget to check out our challenges. We have challenges at various times of the year. We have one coming up now in December. It's over on Substack. And when you comment within a challenge and provide, some feedback for others in the group, we do a drawing at the end of the challenge, and you have the opportunity or the possibility that your name will be chosen to win, in this case, the December gift box, which is filled with all kinds of lovely things. So don't forget to join. So anyways, I want to thank you for joining me today. And let's just keep on keeping on, right? We're in the middle, coming out of, if you're American, you're coming out of Thanksgiving. And we're going into the holiday season, the Christmas season, the Passover season, whatever it is that you celebrate. And let's just be the best that we can possibly be and know that we ourselves can write our next chapters. It's up to us. So take care, everyone. A biento.